Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Rija. As mentioned, I actually am somewhat new to the overall UK and the European tech scene over here. And my prior experience has been in the Bay Area, and before that, I actually grew up in Canada and did some internships here. So I thought potentially something that would be useful is some of the lessons that I've learned and that I've seen play out throughout my career. So, first SERP, tech debt. I assume this is a term that everybody over here is familiar with and hopefully has seen in some capacity. Unless you're working on a completely new piece of infrastructure and system, you probably have some capacity of it within the system that you're currently working on. Or rather, if you don't, then I probably won't believe you, but I'm totally open to learning that you have some somewhat old system and it doesn't have any tech debt associated with it. So very early on in my career at one of my past companies, when I first started, I got to work on this greenfield project. It was like this new client-facing initiative that we did, got a lot of visibility inside the company, had PR associated with it. It went well, it was super great. I was now ready for my next challenge, and I had a conversation with my manager, the VP of engineering, and it's like, oh, well, given the bread and butter of the company and what we deliver to the clients, and we're building out this next new thing there, that's where I'd like to make a focus on. And her response back to me, he's like, okay. He's like, but we also have this tech debt that has been accrued from the past 6 to 7 years, and to be honest, this is the biggest business risk that we have at this point. So unless you're telling me that this, you really are focused and motivated and you want to work on this next new client-facing, shiny new feature, which I think, especially when you're new and junior, that's where a lot of your focus is going to be. And as an aside, I think what sometimes companies tend to do, because ultimately you are delivering the best service and the best product to your clients, to the external clients, sometimes even internally a lot of focus in terms of visibility, communication, and potentially appreciation tends to be on those particular things. So you yourself as an engineer, regardless of which department and which area of the system you're working on, you yourself may not necessarily be, especially if you're very somewhat young and inexperienced, may not necessarily be thinking so much about that, and that's the best way for you to provide delivery. But as a manager, he did a good job of quote unquote inspiring / selling me on this, and this is the best way for you to make an impact. I'm totally on board for that. And also it was the most challenging piece of infrastructure as well too. So there's that part of your brain that's oh yes, I want to conquer that biggest challenge and make the best impact for the thing. It's okay, cool, I'm gonna go and do that and work on fixing this tech debt, all this operability, on-call stuff, and be onboarded onto it. So I onboarded onto on-call, and then I soon realized that it's the problem, and you guys may have encountered this if you have had to tackle this and figure out exactly how you're going to scale the system, is initially there's a lot of noise associated with it. And at least to me at that point, very somewhat young and inexperienced. Are you guys familiar with this garbage island that has been created off of the Pacific Ocean or so? That was the visual that came to my mind. It was there's this huge mess everywhere. I don't even know how to focus on it. They're literally playing this whack-a-mole type of thing all over the place. And some noise that shouldn't actually be happening, waking you up at 2, 3 a.m. and ultimately it actually is not that severe issue and you can actually deal with it later on at 10, 11 a.m. later on. Or some things that potentially people have just become immune to because of the number of times that it has been escalated, and you just accept that, oh, this is totally fine for this to be coming up every so often, and this is the somewhat manual hacky fix that you'll do it, as opposed to the going ahead and doing the root cause analysis. Or maybe you have actually done the root cause analysis, but you just don't feel like you have the time to be able to go and implement that root cause fix such that this and similar incidents do not actually occur again. So my job was to try to navigate this whole system and then try to organize it in terms of these one-off incidents that are happening, try to do root cause analysis, then do scope analysis, and then what exactly is the business impact of this going to be, and then come up with, hey, this is the priority order that we're going to be associating with this and everything, and come up with that overall larger plan. Okay, cool, this is something that I can now go ahead and execute on. The next problem that came for me is, especially within a startup, or rather even within a big company, I don't think any company can ever say that, oh, we fully hired the talent that we need to, and we have all the staffing that we need in whatever area that there may be. You're constantly always looking for great talent, and you can never have enough staffing because the amount of things that you want to do is potentially like conquer the world and build these unicorns and rainbows, and there's client-facing features, and there's all this fun behind-the-scenes stuff. So then when it came down to kind of like the staffing thing, it's like, I can't necessarily do this on my own, and given the size that we were at as well, how do I actually go ahead and get more staffing onto this? So at that point, it was then again kind of a little bit of a fun conversation because, hey, a lot of our staffing and our focus seems to be on those client-facing initiatives as opposed to this area. And while I have come up with this plan, I am going to need more engineers and more of a high-level company focus on this as well too. So the discussion that we then had at this point, my manager who had so amazingly sold me onto this, now I had to sell him onto this vision of, hey, we now need more staffing onto this. His response back to me is like, Rija, I believe you, and also he should totally believe me that this is an area that needs attention because that's literally what he sold me on. I believe you, but in order for me to convince the C-level staff as well as the rest of the company kind of outside of this area who are able to see this, like not just within engineering, but outside of engineering, like product, data, design, engineering, but those cross-functional areas like CS and ops and marketing and research and various other ones, depending on which industry you actually may be in, is human beings are purely just that because we're going to be extremely subjective. So we actually need that data to show these people those metrics, KPIs, whatever you want to call them, to actually say that, hey, this is a priority, this is the business impact that this is actually going to have, right? So while I had come up with that overall larger roadmap, given that particular data, ultimately creating those shiny dashboards as it may be to then show it to the various other people to provide that focus onto them. Now, this is a little bit of an interesting one because, you do want a data-driven approach. Nevertheless, one of the things in terms of communication, especially as you go through your career and become more and more senior, is the level of communication, the type of communication that you're going to be doing to people is going to be varying. So the communication and the data and the types of metrics that are going to be very relevant to the people that are working on the system is going to be a lot more granular. It's going to be a lot more specific. The stuff that you're going to communicate to potentially like the front-end engineers for them to learn about this area, or like the client-facing engineers that are not necessarily working on it, that's going to be a little bit more of a higher level. To the people outside of engineering, that may be a little bit more higher level. To what I showed my VP of engineering and CTO, maybe they'll be looking at the more granular stuff, but at a high level in terms of what the day-to-day consumption is going to be different. Same thing with that C-level staff, and then ultimately if you're even doing some kind of like board presentations on it, right? So like, what exactly are those? And thinking about it in terms of the different business areas of the company. So this would be more so on that platform infrastructure side. What do we care? Like, why should the business actually care about this area, right? So that was to ultimately then go a little bit of a reverse approach because we should have actually already had that to then go ahead and create those metrics. The cool part about that was then that kind of became a little bit of a model for the rest of the company, given the earlier stages that we were in and trying to revamp and reshape everything. And it was also my kind of first lesson in terms of coming up with a roadmap and how exactly you do that. So you're always the company is gonna have some high-level vision / goal of which you're ultimately trying to accomplish, and that's necessitated by some mission that you have. It may be that your vision is to provide the best invoice financing supports to small and medium-sized businesses, but the reason for it in terms of the mission is because you actually want to help the little guy out there as opposed to these big corporations. A similar vision that we have at Market Invoice. And then there's going to be the strategy associated with it, which is going to be based on some like very high-level input combined with like e-staff and some other input that goes into it in terms of like high-level, this is what we believe, how we're going to be actually going through it. And then, of course, there's going to be various different cross-functional areas within the company and various different stakeholders, potentially some even external ones if you're working with some third parties and how that might be dictating the constraints that you're actually functioning under. And then the biggest thing, of course, is the data that's then associated with it, right? Now, in some part, especially when it comes to kind of those platform infrastructure area where you actually have a lot of those metrics, data is going to be a much bigger thing. But when it comes down to those client-facing areas, there's going to be some sort of risk that you take. You will have done some market research onto this. So let's say you've now noted you don't actually have any mobile app, but you're noticing that a lot of people have been signing in using their iOS phones, but you see little to no sign-ins from an Android phone. So based on that particular data, well, you don't know necessarily for sure, but the data is pointing towards that, you'll decide to go ahead and build an iOS app for your particular product. And then potentially when that delivers, and as you ship out and see more traction or you don't, then you can actually go ahead and figure out if you want to be adding more features onto it or not, and maybe over time you'll get better data on the Android side of things as well too. But all of that then comes together for you to go ahead and create that roadmap for you. So I was able to do all of that in terms of that particular behind-the-scenes area. And then later on, when we decided to focus more so in terms of creating this bigger area and taking more client-facing, as the area itself expanded in terms of like more of the client-facing initiatives that we were able to do, it was a nice little juggle, especially in terms of the stakeholder input, because there's going to be other areas that are going to then have an input onto this, and you're ultimately providing them with those particular services. The other part is going to be the iterative and continuously learning. So you're going to do that with the roadmap, as I said, in terms of like some of those client-facing initiatives where you took some level of risk and how exactly you wanted to balance that. And then, as you're delivering on this particular product and features in terms of different milestones that are associated with it, you then go ahead and take a learning. I think the other part where it's extremely important is especially when you are on the more engineering operability side of things is with regards to postmortems. So especially given the area that we were dealing with and in terms of that tech debt, while you do come up with that roadmap, you've done all that analysis, but let's say one incident goes off because, I don't know, maybe something due to a third party has changed or whatever, or maybe you made a mistake in terms of the data that you were looking at and something was missed over there and some production incident went off. Then you go ahead and, of course, you do that immediate fix, you do the root cause analysis, and you go ahead and try to make those fixes associated with it. But I think the overall process that you want to follow is in terms of how exactly did the problem occur and doing that 5 whys approach until you come up with this is the root cause and these are the fixes that we want to make, and assigning some sort of priority order to them and actually assigning them to the roadmap as opposed to this one-off incident that you do, which sometimes people can get in the habit of like, oh, we actually did this post-mortem, we went through this overall exercise and everything, we have done the immediate fixes and we have these like identified these longer term fixes. But if you're actually not putting it back to the roadmap, and I'm actually not able to go back to it, but if you're not actually able to go back to that roadmap and allocate it to it, then you've actually not made that learning as part of that process, right? The other thing is, once you have come up with that particular roadmap and now you're in charge, like you're working on this particular project, you have some sort of tech lead that's associated with it. There's going to be somebody from the engineering side. If this is a client-facing one, probably somebody from like product design, and depending on which area industry you're in, there's probably going to be other cross-functional input that's associated with it as well, right? But so it's not, the data-driven approach that you're trying to take is not just in terms of the roadmap and the projects that you're going to be working on with some sort of understanding of the high-level timeline, but also in terms of those milestones associated with the project. So coming together as an overall group of trying to see, okay, these are the various different features that you're discussing. This is the business impact that it's going to have. Sometimes what can happen is because everybody is going to have different perspectives, and maybe for whatever reason, you sometimes lose sight of that higher level goal of what you're actually trying to accomplish and how that fits into the larger business. Maybe you might be putting more weight into the context that you have as you're trying to come up with the different milestones and the features associated with it, right? And as anybody who's done some part of the exercise, done some sort of leadership role associated with tech, people are always going to want like some sort of like unicorns and rainbows associated with it. And then even when something is delivered, there's that interesting discussion, which also went back to that tech debt thing for me, around like, oh no, this is a bug. No, actually, this is an unsupported feature based on what we came up with at that time. And so educating people, especially non-tech people that may not necessarily be familiar with it. And then, of course, later on, that becomes one of their favorite phrases when discussing with the engineering, product, and design teams around, no, this is tech debt, or this is an on-call issue. Oh, no, this is an unsupported feature type of thing. But that's the type of like that overall like continuously learning approach, as well as that data-driven approach, is what you want to be taking even while you're coming up with it. The other part of it is that when you do launch something, you will, as I said, in terms of some of the client-facing areas, and maybe even in terms of the infrastructure stuff, you will have potentially made some assumptions even with the data that you have, right? So you want to give yourself some like post-launch time in terms of that roadmap to then be able to take in those learnings once you have launched and then see, oh, these are the issues that we are seeing given the feature set that you came up with, and this is potentially the time that we want to spend in terms of going ahead and making those fixes, as opposed to like, okay, I launched, what's the next feature for me to work on, and then like everything is dumped onto that on-call engineer who potentially has no context onto this. Of course, the other part, the flip side of it is that at some point you do need to do that handoff such that that person or those individuals associated with the project do not become those single point of failures, and it's like, oh, you worked on that particular integration with that third party, so I'm always going to be calling on Alice and Bob, and they will always fix this even 6 months down the line. The other part that was a fun learning experience for me is people. So again, going back to that data-driven approach, coming up with the roadmap and figuring out like, hey, this is overall company focus. I think the job of any person in some sort of senior / leadership manager, like whatever term you want to associate with it, and with various different definitions attached to it, is when you have some level of responsibility and you become responsible for an area and or people associated with it, is your job certainly there is to make the company successful, but you're also then kind of beholden to the people that are associated with that particular area and that overall larger team, so to speak. And one of the good quotes that I've read in a book by Ray Dalio that I kind of focus on in terms of my overall management and just overall engineering philosophy is the job of a leader is to figure out an individual's motivations and then make sure they align with the high-level company goal and strategy. Some person might want to be working on the most challenging things. Another person cares more about their overall team and the type of people that they're working with. Another person may actually just want to work on the most shiny features. Another person just doesn't care and want to work on like the most impactful things, and somebody else maybe just wants to see like whatever is going to get me to that like next step for continuously growing and learning, right? So figuring out exactly what those motivations are and then aligning them to that higher level goal. And I believe that's what one of my managers in the past was able to do so well, and how he inspired me to focus on that particular area versus what my very initial thinking had been, that I want to work on the client-facing initiative. The other part, going back to that data-driven approach, is once I was able to actually come up with those particular metrics, like staffing in terms of hiring people externally, as well as some of the people that we hired internally, and the process that we were following was like, hey, what's the company priorities? This was definitely a company priority after we had justified that given the metrics that we had. What are the people's skill set? And there were quite a few people who had that skill set and who could help out. And then what's their interest level, right? So I think that's where that motivation part actually comes in, and figuring out exactly what that motivation is. It's totally extremely subjective, and comes down to communication, because that's the most important aspect of any particular relationship, and especially in terms of overall growth for a particular individual. But the cool part was that given those metrics and being able to show them that this is how best you can make an impact, and this is how it actually aligns with what you're trying to achieve and your overall larger career goal, not just while you're at this particular company. I had a little bit of an interesting problem, like 1 year later down the line, where most of the people actually wanted to work on this area, and ultimately where we were heading towards and the impact that it was going to be making, versus potentially like those client-facing initiatives, so to speak, right? So The other interesting part that then came out of it was, and this is something that I think nobody kind of like teaches you when you're in school, and industry being the best learning experience that you can ever have, is we were hiring a lot of people and onboarding them, both interns, people straight from college and university, as well as senior hires as well too. And when you're going through these like rapid growth phases, sometimes you may not necessarily even have full capacity at that particular time, and you may actually, for some period of time, might be like a net negative for you in the short term to be able to onboard them. But somewhat earlier in my career, that's certainly something that I did not appreciate as much. And while trying to deal with the system, onboard people, and keep up with some of the new other client-facing initiatives and areas we're looking into, this was certainly something that was hard to grasp or even understand. And I think it's one of those things that you have to go through yourself, as opposed to somebody telling you that, no, Rija, believe me, like this is how it's going to turn out, and this is exactly how we should do it. Because it's interesting, as well as I'm trying to onboard some of the younger members on my team onto this same thing, as we're hiring quite a few people at Market Invoice. But when I reflected back on what we had been able to accomplish in like the 1 to 2 year time frame, given what we're trying to accomplish with most of the team that were just hired within that time frame, what I appreciated most, that yes, a lot of what we did was very technically challenging. We had to deal with various different constraints, both internally as well as a lot of them externally, that were just outside of our control, but we had to somehow fit everything together. And while not appreciated, in one case, a compressed timeline that we just had to put up with, but in all of this, when I reflected back, I didn't for a single time doubt that we would actually be able to accomplish any of this, purely because of the people that I had within my team. I think the high-level lesson, and especially something that I've taken away for my for whatever career that I've had, is that I think people are the most important aspect of any entity, organization, any particular project. And if you have the right team, you can overcome any challenges that may be associated with it. It is extremely important to have the right talent to make sure you understand them and they understand you in terms of what that higher-level vision goal is, how their motivations fit in. As much of your input as you can provide, as opposed to purely being like a company's megaphone. There's going to be that high-level vision. It's not like you're kind of like gossiping behind that back, but your job there, and the reason why they're reporting into your within that org for you, is that you are able to provide them with that input, right? Like the information that they may not necessarily be all privy to, or some more color onto it from your perspective. And this is also something, as I'm trying to grow my team at Market Invoice to where they were when I started 4 to 5 months ago, and where we are now and where we plan to be in the next couple of years, is something that's the highest priority for us and we're keenly focused on. And ultimately, these are the people that are going to be delivering on that high-level vision and strategy for you. And it's also one of the reasons why I think kind of working within a startup potentially versus a very large corporation can just deliver a lot of results for you as well, because people can be very early on motivated and see that impact very directly onto it. That's all I have. If you guys have any questions, happy to take them.
Fabulous.
Thank you.